The war had ended 1,000 years ago, yet somehow humanity still carried its scars among the stars. The mist over Kaleth Prime rose like breath from a sleeping giant, veiling the jungle in damp silver. Vines looped between trees like the taut strings of an unseen instrument. Somewhere far off, a bird screamed, or something that had learned long ago how to mimic one. Captain Elias Ward moved through the green twilight with the deliberate calm of a man who had trained his body to obey even when his mind remembered how to be afraid. Around him, the humanitarian column threaded single file. Medics hauling compressed nutrient packs, engineers in Envira cloth, a young translator with nervous hands. They were not soldiers, not really. They were the slim promise humans had offered the Kalethi after the last rebellion burned out, a promise to help rebuild what war had taken. Elias kept his palms open and visible, a silent assurance to the watchers he knew were out there. His helmet remained clipped at his hip, exposing his face to the wet, medicinal air. Scars crawled over his jaw like old rivers. He had made a vow when he took this assignment. If he died here, it would not be with his face hidden. The path curved around a broken column of living stone, a tree that had twisted itself into sculpture. And there, in the root shadow, he saw her. A child. Kalethi. Eyes like liquid silver and a crown of pale quills down the center of her head like sunlight through reeds. She couldn't have been more than 6 human years, though Kalethi aged at angles and tempos humans barely understood. She clutched a bundle of fibers against her chest and stared at the procession with the stillness of prey. Elias raised his hand very slowly, showing his empty palm. "It's all right," he said, soft enough that it became only shape, not sound. The air snapped. Dark figures exploded from the underbrush with the dry hiss of serpents. Bowstrings not archaic, not quaint, but engineered from muscle fiber and bone. Arrows feathered in algae glass. The first volley came at his chest like a thrown fist. Elias moved without thought. He stepped between the child and the storm. His body filled the space where fear had been. The first arrow struck his chest plate and stuck, quivering. The second slid beneath his clavicle, the third punched under the ribs, the fourth found the seam at his shoulder. Pain detonated in white rings. He stumbled, reached back without turning, and pushed the child beneath the root, curling himself over her like a door. Poison breathed into him. He could smell it, hot, sweet, a perfume cooked in hell. Through a blur, he saw the column scatter, medics turning into shields, engineers dragging each other behind bio-boulders that extruded from the ground at a command whistle. A second volley thudded into the living rock. Elias felt his heart punching against a wall that had grown inside his chest. The child's breath was fast and thin against his back. "Stay," he said. "Stay very still." He pulled one arrow free and flung it aside, the edges sizzled where his blood touched them. He tried to lift his weapon, not to kill, only to throw light and sound and confusion, but his fingers had become someone else's. The world narrowed to silver eyes and the slow drumbeat in his skull. A shadow loomed. A rebel with jaw plates tattooed in ash stood over him, arrow notched, poison drooling in a thin thread from the barbed head. There was triumph in the warrior's stillness. There was certainty. The certainty of a kill longed for, finally earned. Elias smiled with half a mouth and said, "Not today." He pushed up, taking the arrow meant for the child into the meat of his shoulder. The shaft cracked against bone. The poison laughed and poured itself into him. He wrapped his arms around the child and rolled them both down the slope into a cloud of luminous spores. The world became green fog and heat and broken light. He reached for his med pack, found it, pressed an auto foam against the arrow wounds that he could reach. Breathing hurt like swallowing glass. Above, distant like thunder, came the deep percussion of allied drones. Loyalist Kalethi, those who had stayed with the old Accord, swept in from the canopy, gliding on membrane wings, voices raised in a war song that had not been sung for a generation. The rebels peeled back. Elias felt hands on him, gentle, firm, many-fingered. He tried to say the child was safe here under him, but he could only shape the words with his eyes. They took her from his arms. The last thing he saw before the poison folded the world shut was her face close to his, eyes wide, the silver trembling like water in a wind. She touched his cheek with the back of her knuckles the way Kalethi children honored their elders, and he thought he heard her say something like a promise. Then the dark took him. For some, death is a door. For Elias, it became a corridor that went on with no light at the end. He walked because he had always walked a habit. In the corridor he remembered earth rain, remembered the smell of machine oil and winter apples in a hangar in the North Massif, remembered a woman's hands that had taught him patience, remembered a knock in the night that had taken her from him. Memory turned to breathe, breath turned to numbers, numbers to the heartbeat that refused surrender. The corridor kept going, he kept going, not out of hope, out of stubbornness. 50 years circled around him without touching him. The universe rearranged its furniture. Star maps grew new scars. Kaleth Prime's jungles ate cities and raised temples. A child learned the weight of a crown. He woke to the hum of a thing too perfect to have been made by human hands. Light from no visible source poured over him like warm water. When he opened his eyes, he saw a ceiling grown from living crystal, facets moving slowly as if tasting the air. He was in a chamber that seemed carved from a single gem, walls that bloomed and folded like leaves, a floor that glowed faintly in the shape of waves. The cryobe below him had been grown around his body like a shell. Roots had become tubes, and tubes had become veins that had learned him. He breathed. His lungs said, "Yes, we remember." But they didn't, not really. Each breath felt like first breath. He pushed himself up. His body obeyed too easily, and that frightened him. He swung his feet to the floor. The stone held a memory of warmth, as if many feet had passed here before him. The air was thick with a sweet mineral scent that made him think of his mother's old copper pots. He put a hand to his chest. Scars wrapped him like an embrace. The holes where arrows had entered and exited were ghost mouths, closed now. He was alive. That felt like both victory and theft. He heard the sound then, a murmur so low it seemed inside his bones. He turned. The chamber opened into a long hall where light pooled in gentle bowls along the floor. Hundreds knelt there, Kalethi in robes and in armor, their heads bowed, their hands crossed over their chests in the ancient sign of witness. Not a sound beyond the rhythm of their joined breaths. At the end of the hall, beneath a throne grown from entwined branches of luminescent stone, stood a woman. Tall, draped in living silk that shifted from green to blue as it moved. Along her scalp, the quills he remembered as a child's crown had become a crest of pale gold that rose like a dawn. Her eyes were an old river. She watched him with something near hunger and near grief and near awe. He knew her before the mind became word. She descended the steps slowly, as if each carried a memory. When she stood before him, she went to one knee and lowered her head. "Elias of Earth," she said in the Kalethi tongue, voice soft as a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. "You took the poison that was made for me. 50 returns have passed. I am a Shanau, a shakel of the twined palms, by oath and by blood, queen to my house and servant to my people. The child you saved kneels to greet you." His throat did a thing that was not speech. He gave a short, ugly laugh that was actually a sob. He had prepared for dying. He had not prepared for surviving into reverence. "I'm no king," he said finally, English falling out of him like a coat too heavy for these warm bones. "Get up." She rose. When she touched his forearm, it was for a second only a test that he was real, that she was not kneeling to a ghost the way lonely hearts sometimes do. "You were kept." The rebels used a sowing of poisons. Their alchemists called it serpent's blossom. "We could not draw it out of you without tearing out the threads that were you. So the criers, the what? Our old ones who fold time into sleep, they wrapped you. They told me I had to wait for your waking if the thing I meant to say was to be said. I have waited." He looked at the faces kneeling. He saw there the fierce softness of a people with sadness braided into their strength. He saw scars that matched his own in different shapes. He saw hope the way a dry riverbed remembers water. "What is it," he asked, "that you meant to say?" Asha lifted her chin. The light caught the gold in her crest and set a halo where none was intended. "I meant to say, I am not here because I am better than them. I am here because you chose for me when I could not choose for myself. There is a world I must carry, but I do not want to carry it alone. We have a war coming." He gave a crooked smile. "I was afraid you were going to ask me to dance." Something like a laugh moved through the kneeling crowd, a ripple of breath and pulse. The Kalethi had learned human jokes in the generation he slept. He felt the gap of years in that shared sound and also a bridge laid across it. Ashad gestured. Guards, if guards could be called such when their spears were grown from living glass and hummed with sunlight, moved aside. A slender figure approached, an elder whose crest had faded to a pale, soft gray like rain cloud. "I am Senvar," he said. "Old enough to remember when your kind came in ships that sounded like thunder. Old enough to know that thunder is just air being heard. You are not thunder, Elias Ward. You are a bell. You were rung and we could not forget the sound." Elias bowed because sometimes that was the only speech there was. "What war?" he asked. "And why me?" Asha led him to a balcony that bloomed open with a sound like stone sighing. Below sprawled a city that had been grown rather than built, streets of living crystal braided like roots, towers like flowers caught in perpetual opening. Above, the canopy parts glittered where solar leaves drank light. Far on the horizon, a dark stain lay on the jungle. "There," she said. "The place the maps call Shalmar and the farmers call the bitter shade. The rebels fled there when the last piece was broken. But it is not only rebels now. Something else has learned our shape, something that wears skin like a borrowed coat. They come in our faces. They open doors we shut for fear. They make promises in the voices of the dead. They have another name among my scouts, the Echoed. When you were sleeping, we fought them and lost and fought them and bled and held and lost again. We learned how to tell their fake from the true, but the difference is so small that grief often doesn't care. The Echoed learned our passwords. They learn the names of our dead. They poison our wells with memories." He looked at the dark stain on the horizon. He felt the old weight return to his hands like a tool he had not wanted to feel again. Shapeshifters. Not in the simple way the old tales use. No bone weaving, no tricks of light. They are a colony breed, a mind folded into a fungus that learns you as it grows through you. When one falls, the rest keep the memory. And you want what? An old soldier who learned to drink recycled water and cross old battlefields with his eyes shut. Asha turned to face him fully. Her eyes were not pleading. They never would be. They were asking the thing worth asking. We want a human who did not leave when everyone else ran. We want a human who made a gesture and understood what it meant. We want the person you were. Are you that person still? He should have said no. He should have said find someone young, someone who bends before breaking. But the corridor he had walked in the dark had taught him something ugly and clean. Refusal can be another kind of cowardice when what is asked is the thing only you can give. He looked down at his hands. They were not the hands of youth, but they were steady. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. She told him. He listened the way he had learned to listen to the rain on tents out where engines were poetry. Below them, the city breathed. The plan was simple the way storms are simple. The Echoed were taking ground by taking faces. The Kalethi had old tests for shame and truth, and newer ones for the fungus pattern in blood. But the Echoed knew patience the way moss knows patience. They would wait until they were everywhere and nowhere, until you had to break your own city to get them out. Asha proposed a thing no one wanted to say out loud, an assault into the bitter shade. Not to burn it out, you cannot burn out a swamp and call it victory, but to cut the colony from its heart and starve the rest of it in the city like a weed with no root. He would lead a small team through paths only human engines had mapped, old channels beneath the crystal streets, maintenance arteries kept secret since the first alliance. He would carry a thing humans had made and sworn never to use again, a song bomb, not explosion, resonance. A chord grown from mathematics and grief that would vibrate the fungus mind until it unwove itself. But the chord had a price. A human nervous system made an exquisite host for it in the same way a fine glass made an exquisite sound when rimmed by a wet finger. He would carry it because any other body would shatter. Your engineers swore not to build these anymore, Senvar said, hands folded. 1,000 years ago you sang a planet into silence because you were afraid. We remember. Elias nodded. We remember too. Will you sing for us? Asha asked, and it was not command. It was prayer said by a woman who had taught herself not to beg. He took the device they brought him, a small thing like a bowl grown to hold light, and held it to his ear. It hummed with a sound too low to be sound. He felt it in the scars the arrows had left behind. He knew what it would do to him. He put it in the pocket above his heart. Where do we start? He asked. They outfitted him in armor that flowed onto his body like a second skin and flashed with the colors of the sea when he moved. They gave him a blade that could drink sunlight and spit it back in a line so thin it could almost cut thought. They gave him a mask grown from a leaf that could teach his lungs to be patient. He accepted them like gifts from a people who would need gifts back. The team that came to him was 5. Senvar insisted on going, and Asha sent her captain of guard, a quiet woman named Rel with a scar that had learned to smile, and 2 scouts who moved like rumors. The 6th was a boy, though he made his crest stand high to look older. He brought Elias water and said nothing and looked everywhere. Later, Elias learned his name was Kerr, and that he had watched his mother die twice, once when she was taken, and once when she returned with a voice that wasn't hers. He understood then that war chooses its own recruits. They went at night when the city's leaves closed their solar mouths and became dark sails. They slipped into the subsidy through a root shaft that breathed damp soil and old iron. Beneath, the crystal changed to bone and bone to clay and clay to something that forgot it had ever been touched by hands. Their lights were patient and kind. Elias walked point because old habits sooner or later become futures we accept. It was not a comfort that he remembered this. Darkness, motion, a rhythm of breathing, the feel of others at his back like words you hadn't yet said but would. He took it anyway. Above, the city exhaled. Below, the world tightened and loosened around them like the belly of a sleeping beast. They reached the first of the old conduits, a tube with ridges like the inside of a throat, walls damp and shining. Elias put his palms to the surface. It remembered him in a way that made no sense and perfect sense. The Kalethi had grown this, but human hands had taught it shapes. He found the notch that wasn't a notch and pulled, and a section of wall dreamed itself open. They slid through. The boy came last, eyes bright. Stay close, Elias said, in case saying it could make it true. They moved for hours until time became only something the body did. Once they heard voices above, words that had once been ridiculous and had learned to be prayer, and once a wash of fluid that tasted faintly of salt passed through the conduit and bathed their knees, a cleansing cycle from the city that did not know they were there. Elias carried the song bomb like a heartbeat. When the first echoed came, they did not arrive the way enemies are supposed to, no drum roll, no trumpet. They were simply there, waiting in a chamber that opened like a bud. They wore the faces of every shape you expected in a Kalethi settlement. A market mother with salt in the creases of her fingers, a scholar with ink on his wrists, a guard with a chip missing from one incisor. Only the eyes were wrong, not dead, not glass, but too crowded like a window with many faces behind it. Rel stepped forward with her spear lowered. "We do not want to kill you," she said. "Not because we are weak, because we are tired." The market mother smiled thin and small. "We are tired too," she said, and behind her voice 100 smaller voices agreed like rain on tin. "You are very loud with your sadness. We like you for that, you taste of memory." Senvar lifted his palm, showing it empty. "There is a sickness," he said, "and a cure. Will you let us pass to the root?" The scholar shook his head slowly. "We are the root." Elias did not lift his blade. He did not have to. The room shifted. The faces shuddered, as if the skin were a curtain rippled by a wind only they felt. The guard with the chipped tooth tilted her head and peered past Rel until she found Elias. The crowdedness in her eyes changed shape. "Ah," she said softly, "there you are." Elias understood then that this would not be a war won by force. It would be a war of stories. The echoed learned by swallowing lives and spitting them back. He wished suddenly for all the things he had thought he no longer needed. A badge, a uniform, the authority of a flag. He had none of those, only the slow gravity of his own past. He stepped forward. "You know me," he said. "Then you know what I will do." "We know what you have done," the voices said together. "We want to taste what you will do. We want your dreaming." "You can't have it," he said, and there was an old meanness in his voice that tasted like gunmetal. "It belongs to someone else." The market mother raised her hand and the echoed flowed like water to block the far door. Elias felt the songbomb warm against his chest, as if it had heard its name. Rel moved in a small step that put her shoulder almost touching his. "Say the word." "Not yet," he said. "We brought a new kind of mercy." He opened his hand, palm up, and the boy cur took it because sometimes a child understands the ritual before the adults do. Elias squeezed and then let go, and the boy slid to the left in a blur too fast for dignity. Rel moved to the right with a twist of spear and step that turned the room like a stage. Senvar spoke a word that taught the door to remember being open. The echoed surged, the crowd of their minds making the space feel suddenly narrow. Elias stepped into the oldest place he knew, the step between breath, and let the world widen. He didn't know if he was still good at this. He had to be. He moved. The blade in his hand made a sound like ice breaking in spring. It didn't sing. It hissed softly, a kindness. He clipped tendons not to punish but to persuade. He laid down a geometry of cuts that made a cage around harm. He did not kill. He did not know if you could kill the echoed. He only made a path in the shape of a human promise. Not here, not now, not the ones behind me. They were through before the room finished understanding that they had gone. They plunged deeper, the conduits narrowing, the air-changing texture, a sourness rising from the floor like old fruit. The walls gleamed with a damp that would have been due if dew had learned to hate. Elias tasted metal. The songbomb vibrated softly against bone. They were close. The root chamber was not a chamber. It was an idea of a mouth, open too wide, filled with a forest of pale structures that were neither stalactite nor stalagmite but the thought of both. They pulsed gently with a light that had no source. In the spaces between, fluid ran in thin sheets like weeping. Elias felt himself starting to drown even though he stood on dry ground. The echoed colony was a presence the way a cathedral is a weight of intention. "It grew on our grief," Senvar said softly. "We watered it with our dead." Rel passed him a pole that sprouted from its tip a tiny bouquet of gold wires. "For mapping," she said. "For being sure." Elias nodded, used the pole, watched it show him in cool diagrams the pattern of the thing's attention. He did not need the map. He could feel it the way you feel a room that doesn't like you. "This is the part where we argue," he said. "No," Asha said, stepping from the shadows as if she had been there all along. She had followed them at a distance no one but she could hold. "No argument, I came to witness. You shouldn't be here. Then I am exactly where I should be." He wanted to say that was the worst logic he had ever heard in a war. He did not. He understood royalty the way one understands whether you could curse it, but you dressed for it. He took the songbomb from his pocket. It fit his palm as if it had been carved from his own bone. Rel watched his face and then looked away. Senvar knelt and said a quiet thing to the floor that was probably older than anyone's anger. The boy cur pressed his lips together until they paled and did not ask to carry the burden instead, which made Elias love him in a way that hurt. "This is a cord," Elias said, and his voice surprised him by being steady. "It will teach the echo to remember the silence before they learn to speak. It will hurt. It might kill me. If it does, do not break the device. Let it sing to the end." Asha looked at him with the terrible dignity of a woman who had kneeled once in a hall filled with light. "What do you want written on the wall when we carve your name?" He considered. "Write nothing," he said. "Let them ask why the space is there." She nodded as if he had given her a gift. He took off his mask. The air here tasted like old coins and rainwater caught in the mouth of a stone lion. He lifted the device to his chest. He pressed it against the sternum where old arrows had once gone in. He touched the rim with his fingertip. The light inside quivered. It began. At first there was no sound, only pressure, as if the chamber had decided he was an egg to be opened. Then a tone rose, not in the ear but in the teeth. A second tone joined it, lagging by a fraction so small it might have been regret. They beat against each other in the narrow space behind his heart, making something like thunder and something like prayer. He felt the colony react. The pale structures trembled as if ashamed to be seen. The fluid between them slowed and sludged and then flowed again in a hurry like a liar changing a story. The cord climbed. It found the scars in him and pressed them, asked them their names. It found the parts of him that had learned to be quiet and pulled them into daylight. He tasted an apple he had not eaten in 40 years. He remembered a smell, engine oil and winter. He remembered a voice, stay. He remembered the tiny weight of a child pressed under his body as arrows found him, and the way her breath fluttered like a trapped bird and then was calm because he said it must be. He wanted to fall. He did not. He stood and let the cord pass through him into the chamber. The echoed screamed. Not aloud, that would have been easy. They screamed in abstract, in pressure and temperature and the sudden awareness of being a thing that could end. The whiteness of the pillars went gray and then darkened like bread overbaked. Where fluid ran, it thickened to a paste and then cracked. The light in the chamber dimmed as if a sun had decided it had done enough and lain down. Rel's hand was on his back. Senvar's voice was a thread he could follow out if there had been an out. The boy cur wept and thought no one saw, which was mercy. Asha stood with her hands at her sides and did not move. The cord reached the place inside the device where design becomes faith. It lifted. It asked a question that had no words. He answered not with his mind but with the stubbornness that had walked the corridor for 50 years. He stayed standing. He held the bowl against bone. The echoed collapsed inward like a thought taken back. The chamber exhaled. Elias realized he had been holding his breath across 3 lives. He let it go. The device went dark. He lowered it. His legs trembled and then remembered how to be legs again. Asha was suddenly very close, her hands on his face. He saw in the tiny lines at the corners of her eyes the 50 years he had not lived, the seasons the city had endured, the nights she had learned to sit with absence until absence became a kind of company. "Breathe," she said. He obeyed. They left the chamber quietly. There was no triumph worth shouting. The war would not end because a single root had been cut. The echoed would still live in 100 small places and come back in 100 small ways as grief does. But this mattered. In the city above, people would sleep and wake and not walk in fear of their mirrors. When they emerged into the light, the sky had become a bowl of hammered copper. The city recognized them and made a sound like a distant river. Kerr ran ahead whooping and then tripped over his own feet and turned the fall into a dance so seamless even gravity applauded. Rel laughed, and the scar on her mouth laughed with her. Senvar leaned on a cane he had not needed before and smiled the way old trees smile in high wind. Asha and Elias stood side by side at the balcony, looking at the stain on the horizon and then at the way the jungle burned gold under the late sun. "You should hate me," Elias said mildly. "I keep making you watch me almost die." "I have been watching you for 50 years, she said. "I would have been angry if you stopped just when I learned how." He felt the laugh rise and decided not to let it out, saving it like a coin. "What happens now?" "We hold," she said. "We teach our people how to tell true from almost true. We will cut more roots. We will grow new ones. We will remember the lesson that almost broke us, that a borrowed face is still a borrowing." He nodded. This was the part war never wrote into its poems, the work after. He looked at her profile, at the way responsibility had carved beauty into her like a river carving a canyon. "Your world is beautiful," he said. "You are part of it now." She replied simply. In the weeks that followed, he learned the city's mourning. He learned the taste of a drink made from a seed that had to be sung to before it would grow. He learned to spar with Rel in a courtyard where vines fell like curtains. She beat him 2 of 3 times and thanked him for the 3rd. He taught Kerr to sit very still for a full minute before acting, and watched him turn that discipline into a kind of magic. He walked with Senvar among the elders, and discovered that wisdom is mostly jokes told very slowly to people willing to listen. He stood with Asha on the same balcony again and again, saying nothing because there are conversations only silence is big enough to hold. Once, when the rains came hard and the city's leaves shivered under the weight, Ashab brought him to the Hall of Naming. It was a place where walls grew soft and took impressions from hands pressed upon them, where the names of the honored were carved in the living stone and the living stone grew itself around the carving so the letters were never sharp. There were centuries there and minutes. They walked without speaking past names that hummed when you thought them in your head. She brought him to an empty panel. The space thrummed in his bones. "We don't write it," he said. She nodded. "We do not write it." They stood a long time in front of nothing. It felt more honest than most memorials. When they left, the room took back the warmth of their bodies and made of it a small lamp no one could see. The echoed pushed at the edges of the forest. They were patient. The city responded with patience of its own. Scouts returned with stories of villages that had come back to themselves, of funerals held for bodies that had housed many. Asha went to each and knelt among the mothers and let them speak until their words ran out and then kept sitting until their silence did too. Elias went with her sometimes because he had learned that his face, old as it was, did a particular thing in their eyes. It made them feel their children were not alone. This is what alliance looks like when the flags have been put away. Not signatures, but the way a stranger's hand holds yours without asking why it must. On a morning that began with fog like silk slung low, a messenger came up the long stairs to where Asha and Elias were sharing fruit on a wide step. The messenger's crest was wet with rain. He bowed the bow of urgency she had told them to use only when urgency was not their own fault. "Say," Asha said. "The bitter shade grew a new mouth," he said. "It opens toward the river that feeds the north gardens." It sang to a boy and he went in and came out smiling. "Whose boy?" Elias asked softly. "Mine," the messenger whispered, and the truth in his voice made the step beneath them feel suddenly very small. Asha stood. She did not raise her voice. "Call Rel, call Senvar, tell Kerr to bring the pack with the shells that smell of ash." They went without the procession of a crown. There were no banners, no drums. 6 people walked into the fog, and the fog closed kindly around them. They found the new mouth where the river had eaten a bend into the jungle. It was not like the root chamber. It was smaller, hungrier. The air there felt like a word about to be said that should not be. The boy stood near the water, smiling gently at nothing. His eyes had a crowded window look. He held a pebble as if it were a jewel. Asha went to her knees slowly, as if lowering herself into a story that might break if rushed. "Little one," she said, "what song did you hear?" "The nice one," he said, and the voices behind his voice agreed. "The one that says I can be many and then I am never alone." Elias felt something very old move in him, like an animal that had woken because it had smelled smoke in the walls. He stepped back and took the ash-smelling shells from Kerr's pack, nodded to Rel, and together they lit them and waved the smoke with slow hands so it made lace in the air. The echo twitched away from the scent the way a lie twitches when you speak the name of the person it has stolen. "Come away," Asha murmured, and then did the bravest thing a queen can do. She put her hand into the water. The mouth hissed. The boy flinched. Asha kept her hand there even though the water tried to learn her. Elias saw the muscles in her arm stand out and knew the colony was asking her to remember other things: her mother's face, the play of light on a throne when she first sat on it, the sound of a child laughing in a hall where no children had been allowed, and he saw her refuse. She is a stone, he thought, and stones are only slow water. "Come, little one," she said again. "My palm is a place where you are one. It is a small place, but it is yours." The boy's crowded eyes cleared like water after a boat passes. He blinked and then howled and flung the pebble at the river. Asha pulled him to her chest and held him while he shook. Rel stood between them and the mouth. Elias scattered more ash scent until the hungry in the air became only air. They stood there long after the boy had stopped shaking. The jungle watched them with the humble arrogance of old green things. The river went on because that is what rivers do. Asha finally raised her head and looked at Elias, and in that look they both said the thing they did not need words for. "This will keep happening. We will keep answering." "How many times?" he asked gently. "As many as it takes," she said. "I am not a queen if I count." He smiled. "Then we are rich." The seasons turned. Elias learned the winter here was only rain that had forgotten how to be polite. He learned to sleep in a room that never fully darkened because the walls liked to glow when they dreamed. He learned his own limits and found them kinder than he remembered. Once, when he stood near the hall of naming, the empty space still empty, a holiness, a woman approached carrying a bundle. She was human. He had not seen one here in months. She wore the weight of a scientist the way some wear jewelry, as if it had been earned and polished. She told him she was from the outpost up in the hills, the one that traded instruments for fruit. "We heard you woke," she said. "We argued about what it meant. What did you decide? That it meant a story wanted to be finished?" He laughed and felt the scar in his shoulder answer. "They never do." "True," she said, "but someone has to keep telling them." She asked for his account of the first volley, the poison, the arrows. He gave it to her. But when she wanted to turn it into data, he put a hand on hers gently until she understood. Some things are not numbers because they would become less than themselves if they were. At a festival held when the sky went red for 3 nights in a row for reasons no one could explain, the city taught its children a new game. They would tell a story, and then the other children would tell it back wearing a borrowed face but with truth in their eyes. The rule was that if the truth slipped, everyone would stop until the truth returned. It was a game only this city could have made, and it was how a people learns to be brave without being cruel. Elias sometimes walked alone into the jungle and let the world make him small. He found the root where he had protected a child and sat with it across many afternoons until he felt the kindness in the bark. He pressed his hand there, and the root remembered him with a slow warmth that moved up his arm and into his chest and made breathing feel new again. On one such day he heard a rustle that was not an animal's disinterest. He turned. A figure stood at the tree line, face in shadow. For a long breath they only watched each other. Then the figure stepped forward. It wore human boots and an envirocloak too clean. Its eyes were crowded. It smiled badly. "You taste like long stories," it said. "I'm fresh out," Elias said. "Ah," the echoed said with 100 soft voices. "But we brought you something, a memory you forgot to forget." It stepped closer. It smelled like rain and mold and absence. Elias did not lift his blade. He put his hand to the root behind him as if to show it the thing he had become and to ask it what to do next. The echo tilted its head as if listening to distant music. "What do you want from us?" Elias asked. "There has to be something other than hunger." "We want to hold," it said. "You scatter, we gather. You die alone, we die as a we. You are a continent of small griefs, we are an ocean of one." He sighed. "An ocean drowns. A continent erodes," it replied softly. He stepped toward it until they were breath close. He could see under the face then, not physically, but like seeing through a lie because you loved the person who told it. There were children in there and old women who had known sunlight only through leaves and boys like Kerr who wanted to be useful at any cost. The fungus mind did not violate them, it wore them like weather. That was its sin. He lifted his hand. He put his finger on its brow. He felt the hum of the cord still alive in his bones, a seed that had not finished being a plant. "Let go," he said gently. "Not because of us, because of you. You are learning the wrong lesson." "And which is the right?" it asked with a sad smile not entirely its own. "That sometimes the only way to be many is to make space for one." He stepped back. He waited. The echo watched him with all the eyes it had borrowed and then did a small, shocking thing. It shook its head, a human gesture learned and repurposed, and then its crowded eyes became less crowded. It sighed once. It took a step back. It melted into the green without sound. He realized then that victory would not be a trumpet. It would be a million small surrenderings like that, in the quiet between disasters, in the time when you decided not to take something because you realized you did not need it. He told no one of the encounter. He kept it like a jewel in a pocket and took it out only at night when the city hummed softly, when Ashaz's footsteps went past his door toward the long room where queens learned to sleep with their worries without holding them too close. On the day the comet came, low and bright and insolent, a ritual was called that had not been called since before he was born. The high platforms were opened. The people climbed not to watch the sky, but to let the sky watch them. Ashaz stood at the center platform with her arms bare to the shoulder, a pattern of ash and pollen traced along her skin like a map of rivers. Elias stood in the second circle with the elders and the children who had learned the courage game. The comet wrote a brief line across the day and was gone, a show-off. The crowd breathed in and then out. Ashaz lifted her voice and sang not the old war song, not the new game song, but a simple tune that had been hummed by mothers to babies forever. The city joined, the jungle joined, even the river crooned in its gravel way. Elias felt the cord in his chest stand and bow and sit again as if thanking the room for its kindness. After Ashaz came to him, they did not stand like rulers and advisors or saved and savior. They stood like two people who had learned one another's shadows. "I thought often," she said, "about what I would say when you woke. And everything I rehearsed was too small. Perhaps the small things are the right ones," he said. "What would you say now if you had to say only one sentence to me for the rest of our lives?" She smiled. "Eat," she said, "and then help me carry." He laughed the coin laugh he had saved and then spent it gladly. They ate fruit that tasted like memory and salt, and then they carried baskets of seeds to the north gardens so the children would have something to plant when the rains came back. And the rains did come back, and the echo came back too, but in smaller ways each time, as if remembering the silence had taught them to be shy. And people kept dying because that is a thing people do, but they died less afraid and more held. And the city kept glowing at night, not bright, never bright, just enough. And the hall of naming kept its empty space. Years like this stacked themselves like pages in a book he would never finish reading. And one morning Elias woke and realized his hair had gone white at the edges the way frost takes a window. He did not mind. He went to the balcony. Ashaz was already there, a shawl around her shoulders, the gold in her crest bright as if it had stolen a piece of the sun for itself. They watched the city for a while, both being greedy with the sight. "Once," he said, "I took arrows for a child." "Once," she said, "a child learned to kneel not to a man but to a moment. And now we kneel to nothing. We stand to everything." He leaned on the railing and let the words lodge in him the way good seeds do. He thought of the corridor he had walked, and of the day it ended in light and kneeling, and of the way her eyes had looked the same eyes as the child, only deeper, and of the way the crowd had breathed together as if learning the first step in a dance no one had seen performed yet. He thought of the boy Kerr grown taller than him, of Rel retiring her spear to a place on a wall where it would never grow dust, of Senvar sitting in a garden telling a joke so long birds nested in his pauses. He thought of the world's long patience with them all. He did not think of leaving. The thought didn't come. He had already done the leaving that mattered and been returned. When the next threat rose not from the echoed, but from a human company that had decided Kaleth Prime was a resource rather than a home, the city stood as one. Human ships came with contracts like jaws and drones like teeth. They spoke the language of efficiency, which is always the language of speed without memory. They expected the Kalethi to bow and the old human on the balcony to step aside because this was progress and progress is polite until it is not. Elias put on the armor that had learned his shape and walked to the landing field with a Shah at his side and the city behind them like a hand behind a shoulder. The company's representative was a man whose suit had never known even the memory of rain. He smiled with the square toothiness of prophet. "You must be Elias Ward," he said. "A legend, an inspiration. We have a medal we'd like to give you posthumously if that can be arranged." Elias looked at the ships. He looked at the people they carried who were not evil, only hungry. He looked at a Shah and saw in her eyes the 1,000 years of wars behind every piece. He did not reach for a weapon. He reached for the pocket above his heart, and his fingers touched the bowl that no longer sang, and yet had taught him how to sing even when he had no device in his hands. He lifted his voice in the language of contracts and told a story. He told it like a human can tell it when the telling matters more than the winning. He told them about poisoned arrows and a child who had learned the weight of a crown, and a city that grew itself, so it would never be at war with its own shadow. He told them about the echoed, and how hunger can be taught to be shy. He told them about a hall with a space where a name was not written, and how sometimes you must leave a place empty, so that everyone who passes asks themselves why. He spoke for a long time, and in the end he said, "You can stay, but if you stay you kneel not to us, to this place, to the way it has learned to keep its children safe." The representative's smile thinned. The drones above hummed and then stilled as if confused. The people behind him waited for a command that did not come. The company had never been told a story it had to obey. The story did not care. It went on with or without them. Some left. Some stayed and learned to kneel and discovered it did not make them smaller. The city made room. It always would. That was its strength and its sorrow. On the evening of his last year, though of course he did not know it was his last, we only know that after Elias walked again to the route where he had first fallen. The jungle had eaten and returned and eaten as it does. He sat and let the old ache in his shoulder and the new ache in his knee talk to each other. He closed his eyes. He heard someone come through the ferns. Asha sat beside him without asking, as was her right. She had a bottle with her and 2 cups grown from leaves and hardened by attention. She poured and handed him one. It tasted like roasted sunlight and long afternoons. "I dreamed," she said, "that I was a child again and that you were young and that we were both standing in the hall just before you woke." "What did I look like?" he asked, amused. "Taller," she said gravely, and he laughed until he coughed. And then she waited patiently until he was done, because anyone can be a queen of many things, but the true test is whether you can be a queen of someone else's coughing. They drank in companionable quiet. The light went from gold to a color you only get on worlds with too much oxygen and too many memories. He thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that maybe the corridor had not been a corridor at all, but a long road to this exact moment. He set down his cup. "If I don't wake tomorrow," he said, "remember to leave the wall as it is." She did not look at him. "We will leave it. And teach them," he said softly, "the game, the one where you pretend to be someone else and then you remember to be yourself. They are already better at it than we ever were," she said. "Good," he said. They sat until the jungle folded itself into night. The city lit itself, small and kind, like a river of fireflies. The river whispered. Somewhere, a child laughed, and somewhere else someone wept, and in 100 houses people held each other without needing to explain why. This is what victory sounds like: small, ordinary, stubborn. Elias closed his eyes and let the world hold him. In the darkness behind his lids he saw a corridor again, but this time there was light at the far end and hands reaching. He walked toward it because he had always walked toward the thing that asked him to. He felt the bowl in his pocket warm once, as if something inside had wanted to say goodbye. In the morning, the city woke to the news that a man had died sitting beside a root where he had once taken arrows for a child. They did what they had learned to do. They did not carve his name. They made a space where it would have been and told their children to ask why. Asha stood before the empty panel and did not speak for a long time. When she finally did, it was to say, "Eat, and then help me carry." And the city did. Years later, when people asked when the turning point had been, some said it was the day the song was sung in the root chamber. Some said it was the day a queen put her hand in a river that wanted to borrow her face and refused. Some said it was a day still to come, because if you pick a final place to call the turning, you will forget to keep turning. But the story that the children loved best was the old one, the high one, the one that walked with them like a tall shadow when they were brave and stood with them like a small candle when they were scared. The story of a man who had stepped into a storm of poison fire, not to win a battle, not to earn a crown, but to make a space where a child could breathe. They told it in deep voices. They told it with their hands. They told it while planting seeds and while carving names and while holding the heads of their dying. They told it while washing bowls and while braiding hair and while arguing about taxes and while making love. They told it because that's how a people keeps the shape of itself from going strange. And whenever the story reached the part where the man woke 50 years later to find a woman kneeling before him as a queen, their voices softened, and the youngest among them leaned closer, and the oldest closed their eyes because they could see it still. The hall, the light, the kneeling, the old man trying to be smaller than he was because awe made a tightness in his throat. They learned from it the thing that needed learning, the lesson that had saved them when nothing else had worked. That strength is not the same as conquest. That kneeling is not the same as surrender. That love, when it is finally brave, is just another word for endurance. Headphone, if you're enjoying this story, take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps keep humanity's stories alive among the stars. So the years went on, and the city endured. And the jungle took and returned and took again, and the river taught new mouths to be quiet, and the echoed learned shyness, and human ships came and left and came again, kneeling or not, and the children played the courage game until it became who they were, and the empty panel in the hall of naming took the hands of the grieving and warmed them and sent them home, and the queen grew old and then did not, and new queens learned the steps, and the bells rang when thunder tried to say it was king. And every time the story was told at the very end, when the little ones were drifting on the edge of sleep, and the older ones were pretending not to wipe their eyes, the teller would lower their voice and say the line no one ever forgot, the one that fit inside a mouth like a promise and inside a city like a spine. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.